What are the goals that you have for the future? Where does God fit into your plans? Jesus said, what profit a man if he gain the whole world but lose his soul? What shall a man give in exchange for his soul? John wrote, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father cannot be in him. Friends, God demands first place. There is reward. There is joy for the man and the woman that gives God first place. A lot of people come up to me and say, Brother Johnson, how did it happen that you became a missionary? What is your background? How come you're so well known in Brazil today? The name Bernhard Johnson in Brazil is just as well known as the name Billy Graham in this country. Why is it that God has enabled me to be a blessing to that nation and to other areas of the world? I want you to tell you tonight why this happened. Not only do I have the example of my Christ and my Master and my Lord, but I had a godly Father that taught me the way and showed me the way. I'm going to close tonight with your permission to tell my father's story. It's a story that I trust will be an encouragement to you. My father was born in Sweden in 1894. Now, some of you dear people thought I was Spanish or Italian or Brazilian, didn't you? And you're surprised to find out that I'm Swedish and Norwegian. My father's born in Sweden, my mother's born in Norway. How I turned out dark like this is beyond me. But it's a tremendous advantage to look like the people down there. I guess you'll have to call me a smoked Scandinavian because I just turned out like this. Well, going back to the story, my father was born in 1894 in Sweden. As a little boy, he used to go down to the docks and see the big ships come in from all over the world. He used to tell his parents, when I grow up, I'm going to be a sailor. I'm going to travel all over the world. And his mother and dad would say, oh, no, you're not. We have other plans for you. And one day my dad became so desperate, he wanted to be a sailor. When he was 12 years old, he ran away from home and hid on a Norwegian freighter down at the docks that was headed the next day to Brazil, South America. He hid in a lifeboat, and that next day that Norwegian freighter took off to sea. After they were out to sea for 3 days, this 12-year-old boy pops out of the lifeboat. It almost drove the captain and the crew nuts. They said, what are we going to do? A 12-year-old kid, 3 days out at sea. They were carrying some perishables, some fish aboard. They couldn't turn back. They said, we've got to take this kid with us for the whole trip of 60 days. And when we come back to Sweden, we'll turn him over to the authorities. So my father went on his first overseas trip when he was 12 years old as a stowaway. They went to Brazil, and there he couldn't get off the boat. He stayed on the ship so the authorities wouldn't find him. And 2 months later, that ship came back to Sweden and docked in his port city. But the captain and the crew had made him the mascot of the ship. And when they docked back in Sweden, instead of turning him over to the authorities, they hid him on board again. And my dad traveled for 17 years on that ship. They taught him the trade of engineering. He became the chief engineer on that Norwegian freighter. For 17 years, he traveled on the same ship all around the world. In those 17 years, that ship docked in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, 22 times. And every time it docked there, my dad, as a drunken, brawling sailor, would get off the ship, give problems to the authorities, and have to be chased aboard to not be thrown into prison. After 17 years of this life and seeing the world, going all around the world, he got tired and disgusted and disillusioned. And one day he was even thinking of committing suicide and putting an end to it all because he had run away from his parents, had despised his home. And after 17 years of traveling around the world, one day that ship came from South America and docked in San Francisco, California. The first thing my father did, without even bothering to change his clothes, he got out of that engine room and headed down for 3rd and Howard Street. If any of you are acquainted with San Francisco, you know that 3rd and Howard Street is the bum district, the waterfront of San Francisco. And that's where my father headed for, to 3rd and Howard Street, where the action was, where the drunks were. And on the way down from the boat to 3rd and Howard, he stopped to get a couple of drinks. But to his surprise, when he came to the corner of 3rd and Howard, there was a street meeting going on by a group of Pentecostal young people. About 30 young people out on the street corner with guitars, accordions, trumpets, trombones. Now, maybe some of you young people don't know this, But 30 and 40, 50 years ago here in the United States, you could find street meetings going on in every major city of America. And you'd be surprised how many of our missionaries and our pastors and evangelists were saved in rescue missions or street meetings in the waterfront areas of our major cities. My dad was one of them. He came down to 3rd and Howard Street, and he saw this group of young people, and he laughed at them. He said, what a bunch of sissies. 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds standing out there. I love Jesus. Jesus is so wonderful. What do they know about life? And he said, I'm not going to stand and listen to these sissies. And he turned around to walk away, and his legs and his feet became heavy as lead. He found he couldn't move. He could just sort of crawl along. And he thought to himself, am I being paralyzed? What's happening to me? The Holy Spirit pinned him down. Well, he finally managed to get to a doorway of a tavern. And he hid there in the doorway. And he said, I might as well listen to what they've got to sing and what they've got to say. And as he stood there peeking out of the doorway of the tavern, a young Christian boy, 18 years old, who is still alive today in Petaluma, California, whose name is Sigurd Womark, who was also of Swedish descent, spotted my dad there in the doorway of the tavern. And he said, man, there's a soul for Jesus. And he looked at my dad, who weighed about 240 pounds. And he said, man, I can't just walk up to that sailor. I'm liable to get clobbered. He said, I got to catch that fish by surprise. So he walked clear around the block. And while my dad was hiding in the doorway, this 18-year-old boy came up from behind him and punched him in the stomach. And my dad turned around and said, kid, what are you trying to do? And that 18-year-old boy said, mister, you're not a happy man, are you? My dad said, what business is of yours whether I'm happy or not? And that young man said, I can tell by looking in your face you're an unhappy man. And he said, you need Jesus. And my father said, kid, you're right. You guessed right. I've traveled all around the world. I just got off the ship now from South America. I'm unhappy. The young man said, you're going to find happiness tonight. And he said, when this street meeting's over, you're going down to the church 7 blocks away from here. You're going to walk down there with me. And my dad said, oh, no, I'm not. He said, I've had a couple of drinks already. I've got liquor on my breath. He said, I came directly out of the engine room. Look how dirty my clothes are. That young man insisted when the street meeting was over, he took my dad by the arm and walked him the 7 blocks. And that night, an old drunken Swedish sailor was wondrously saved by the gospel of Jesus Christ. About 1 o'clock in the morning, oh, they used to pray through in those days. About 1 o'clock in the morning, he got off his knees. And he said good night to everybody and ran down to the boat. And he woke up the captain and the crew, and he said, men, I've got it. They said, you've got what? He said, I got Jesus. And he said, tomorrow night you're all going to church with me. The captain stood up and said, Johnson, if you've got religion and salvation, you get off this ship now before we kill you. We've harbored you from authorities for 17 years. We've been a father and a group of brothers to you. And now you're going to turn religious. You get off this ship. My father packed a little bag of belongings, went off the ship and went back to church. In those days, they had all-night prayer meetings. When he got back to the church about 3 o'clock in the morning, the pastor was still there and a group of believers. And my dad came to the pastor and said, Pastor, is there a place where I can stay overnight? There was another Swedish family standing nearby, the Johansson family, that still live in Redwood City today. And Sister and Brother Johansson said, sure, come and sleep at our house. And my father lived with them for 6 months. Well, when he got off the ship, he didn't know any other life, so he got a job on a tugboat in San Francisco Bay. And one day the tugboat was going to go up to Alaska to bring back down a barge. And on the way to Alaska, the tugboat stopped in Seattle, Washington. And the first thing every new convert does when he goes to a new city is find an Assembly of God church or a Pentecostal church. And my father went to the old Fremont Tabernacle, and there he met a beautiful young lady that had just recently come over from Norway. I guess it was love at first sight, because when he came back from Alaska, he left her the engagement ring, and 3 months later went back to Seattle, brought her down to California, and married her. And this young lady put her foot down and said, Bernhard, I'm Bernhard Jr., said, Bernhard, you're not going to be even on the tugboat any longer. And he said, honey, this is the only life I know. She said, find another profession, because I'm not going to worry about you being out at sea or even in the bay. So my father became a carpenter. Well, what's so bad with being a carpenter? Jesus was one, and my father became a very successful carpenter. In 35 and 36, he became not only a successful carpenter, but a contractor. And if any of you have ever heard of Henry Dozier, who became one of the largest home developers on the West Coast and in the United States, my father became a partner in construction with Henry Dozier. He could have made a fortune. He had everything favorable. Everything he touched turned into money. One day he was out on the job. My dad was now 44 years old. An older sister had been born into the family. I was 6 years old. And one day, when he was out working on a home with his crew, the Holy Spirit turned to him and said, Bernhard Johnson, go to Brazil as a missionary. I never forget that afternoon when my dad drove up in the pickup. He hollered out to me. I was playing on the street. He said, Bernhard, come on into the living room. I thought, oh God, what did I do now? Because every time the family was called into the living room, it meant trouble. And usually I was the one in trouble, and I tried to think, what did I do now? Why is it that the family has to go into the living room? And when I walked in there, I saw my tears streaming down my dad's cheek, and he called Mom and my sister and me together. He embraced all three of us, and he said, you're going to faint, but God called me to be a missionary to Brazil. He turned to my mother and said, Antoinette, will you go with me? She said, Bernhard, God's been speaking about it to me too. She said, if you're willing to go, I'll go with you. They got in the car and left us two kids home and drove down to talk to our pastor. I'm not going to tell you who the pastor was at that time in San Francisco because he's still very much alive today and comes to Springfield quite often. But my father went down to his house and talked to him. And he said, Pastor, God told me to go to Brazil. Will the church give us any support? And the pastor laughed in my dad's face and said, Johnson, you're out of your mind. You're 44 years old. You're too old to go. You've never pastored a church. You don't have 1 hour of Bible school. You've never learned to speak English right. You know how these Scandinavians murdered the English language. My dad was a professional in murdering the English language. He had never learned to speak it right. And the pastor turned to him and said, Johnson, how could you ever learn Portuguese? That is far harder than English when you can't learn English. My father said, but Pastor, God has told me to go. Will you support us? The pastor said, we won't give you 1 nickel of support. You're out of your mind. You're just mistaken what the Holy Spirit said. My father said, all right. He prayed some more. And then he made a trip here to Springfield, Missouri. Uh-oh, this is going to get close to home. He came to headquarters. And he met with the committee. And he told them of his burden. And they very politely and very nicely informed him that he was just too old. That 44-year-old man, without a day of pastoral experience and without an hour of Bible school training and without knowing how to speak the English language, just couldn't go to a foreign field. In the natural, he did not qualify. When he walked out of the office, one of the men turned to him and said, Mr. Johnson, we can't send you. What are you going to do? My father very politely turned and said, I'm going anyway. And he walked out of the office, went home, sold all his belongings, all the homes he owned, the cars, the pickups, the tools and everything. And when I was 8 years old, we got ready to go to Brazil. I'll never forget the day we left San Francisco. We got on the train to go to New Orleans, and then got on a slow boat to Brazil. It took us 5 days, and I'll never forget that train depot in San Francisco. The pastor was there, about 300 people from the church. My unsaved relatives were there, an aunt and an uncle on my mother's side. They were all crying. Everybody had their handkerchiefs out, and everybody was boo-hooing. Well, I was only 8 years old. When I saw everybody cried, I just cried along with the rest of them. And I said, but they weren't crying because they were going to miss us. They were crying because they felt sorry for us. They thought we were out of our minds. And in the midst of all those tears, and drying tears with handkerchief and waving handkerchiefs, as the train pulled out, I looked into my dad's face, and he had a smile from ear to ear. And I thought to myself, how can Dad be so rude? Here everybody's crying. The pastor, the church people, the relatives are crying. And he's laughing about it. Well, I was raised a little different from some kids nowadays. When my father wanted me to know something, he told me. If he didn't want me to know, I just didn't go around asking a lot of questions. So I didn't say anything, but I kept it in my heart. 5-day train ride to New Orleans, and then we got on an old slow boat to Brazil. 28 days on sea. I'll never forget the morning that we arrived in Brazil. In December of 1939, the captain announced over the ship, we're coming into Rio de Janeiro. Get up and get your things packed and get ready for customs, your documents in order. I was just a little boy, so in my pajamas, I ran up to the deck, and I leaned over the railing and began to look at the city of Rio de Janeiro. I saw the Sugarloaf Mountain on one side. I saw the statue of Christ up on the Hunchback Mountain. I saw the white sands of Copacabana Beach.